Hello. We're going to talk about 6.37. So if you remember in 6.36, we were distinguishing between two different types of proteins, one being an antigen, which is not you, if you remember, and one being an antibody, which are these globular proteins in the shape of a Y that attach to antigens and is a major way we defend ourselves against diseases. So we're going to talk specifically how these antibodies are produced, and there's a chain of communication that we're going to talk about that allows this to happen. All right, let's begin. So let's start with a protein that's entered our protein. Let's say it's a bacteria. Let's make it a virus. So let's say we have a virus that's entered our body, and on the surface of this virus, there are proteins, and these proteins are not you, and these proteins here, these green proteins, would be our antigens. So there's a couple of different things that can happen that can instigate or start, I should use the word initiate the production of antibodies. One is just themselves is enough information for the antigen to finally reach this other cell called a B cell, which we'll talk about down here, to produce these antibodies. But a more effective system is when you have something called a macrophage that will consume it. Now, there's two terms. Sometimes we call them macrophages. Sometimes we call them phagocytic leukocytes. They're the same thing when you hear me say that. So this macrophage is this big leukocyte, this big white blood cell, which will engulf this virus. And what it does, it breaks it down into a whole bunch of little different pieces. So maybe there's like the outer shell here and the outer shell here. It's broken it into smaller pieces. But also, more importantly, are these antigens, these surface proteins. So what the macrophage will do is it will present this antigen on one of its surface proteins, on the outside of this gigantic white blood cell, this perfect white blood cell. It will present it and communicate this information to a very specific type of white blood cell. So here we have this protein here attached with this antigen to say, hey, look what we found. This is a non-self protein that we found in our body. This protein has a very complicated name. It's called the major histocompatibility complex. So it's actually not it's the major histocompatibility complex, and sometimes we'll just call it MHC. So we have this major histocompatibility complex that will present this antigen. The first cell it presents it to is something called a T cell. So the T cell is going to get this information with this antigen, and it actually will attach the antigen to the T cell. So now it has it on its surface, and the macrophage says, hey, T cell, we're being attacked by this virus with this specific antigen, right, with this green antigen. So anytime you see green, I want you to think of it as that antigen, which is a protein that is not you. So that T cell has that antigen, and what the T cell will do is it's going to travel and give this information to the cells that make antibodies. And the cells that make antibodies are our B cells. So it's going to give that information to a B cell. Let's make the B cell this color. And the B cells, remember we talked about, or maybe we didn't yet, but we talked about this idea called clonal selection, which is when this B cell, when it gets this information about this antigen, will begin by making lots and lots of copies of itself. So it's making clones. So here's another B cell. And here's another B cell. So you make all of these B cells, probably hundreds of millions of them, that will all end up producing the antibody for that specific antigen. These B cells have a specific name. So the B cells that make antibodies are called plasma cells. I'm making a mess here of my beautiful slide. So these are plasma cells. So the B cells that make antibodies are plasma cells. Let's draw a couple antibodies here. So there's one antibody, remember, in the shape of a Y, 2 antibodies, 3 antibodies. So all of these antibodies are being produced by all of these plasma cells. Another type of cell this will divide into, it's also a type of B cell, but it has a specific name because its job is to hang around and wait for the next infection. And these cells right here are called memory cells. So you have millions of B cells, all clones, all making the same antibodies to defeat this virus that's attacked you, or maybe this bacteria, but in this example, it's a virus. And we are also going to make a group of memory cells so the next time you get sick, we can have an immune response happen much quicker. And then you never know you're sick. The virus has entered your body, and boom, you have the immunity for it, and you can defeat the disease very quickly. These are called memory cells. Just one more thing about these groups of cells, because sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. All white blood cells are called leukocytes. So sometimes you hear me talking about leukocytes. And the two main groups of leukocytes, one are these macrophages, which we've talked about in this section, and the other one, which include T cells and B cells, and remember B cells include plasma cells and memory cells. This group of cells here are called lymphocytes. So those are our two groups of cells, and sometimes that can be a little bit confusing when we're talking about that.